So let's take a few minutes and talk about the solar system. There used to be 9 planets in the solar system: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Pluto's still there. However, a guy by the name of Mike Brown from Caltech decided it didn't deserve to be a planet anymore. We'll come back to that later. So, technically, there are currently 8. And Pluto got demoted by the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, after they made up some rules. A planet has to be in orbit around the Sun. All 9 fit. The planet has to be big enough to be round. All 9 fit again. This is called hydrostatic equilibrium. And it has to clear its orbit. Pluto doesn't clear its orbit. So Pluto got kicked out. Thanks, Mike Brown. So, Mercury. Mercury is the planet that's closest to the Sun, and it's named after the messenger god. It's hot, but it's not nearly as hot as Venus. And it orbits the Sun every 88 days and doesn't have any moons. Venus is the second planet from the Sun and is named after the Roman goddess of love and beauty. Venus is hotter than Mercury. Venus orbits the Sun every 225 days, and each day lasts 116 days. So a day is half a year on Venus, and it doesn't have any moons. Earth is the third planet for the Sun and isn't named after a god. Earth simply means ground. Some neat things about Earth: you live here, and it has 1 moon, sort of. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Mars is the 4th planet from the Sun and is named after the Roman god of war. It's red and is the reason we call aliens Martian. Aliens from Mars, Martians. It's red because a layer of rusted iron dust sits on the surface that reflects the light of the Sun, and it has 2 moons. Jupiter is the 5th planet from the Sun and is named after the Roman king of the gods. The Greek king of the gods, which tends to be more familiar to people, is Zeus. Jupiter is also the biggest planet and has 67 moons and counting. That red dot that you see in the middle of the picture is a storm that swirls on roughly the same spot for as long as we've seen it. Saturn is the 6th planet from the Sun and is named after the Roman god of agriculture. Saturn has the most defined rings and has 62 moons and counting. Uranus, or some people like to call it Uranus, but most scientists like to call it Uranus because they don't like the sound of Uranus, which is kind of silly because I think Uranus sounds much more funny than Uranus. This is the only planet other than Earth that is not named after a Roman god. It has 27 moons and counting. Neptune is the 8th planet from the Sun and is named for the Roman god of the sea. It has 13 moons and counting, and its orbit crosses that of Pluto, which we'll come back to in a minute. So Pluto, is it still a planet? It used to be the farthest from the Sun, but it's not always. Sometimes its orbit crosses that of Neptune's. So before we get into why I'm annoyed about Pluto being demoted, let's remember it was named by an 11-year-old girl, Venetia Burney, and it has 5 moons, and counting. So why did it get demoted? There's a guy by the name of Mike Brown from Caltech who decided with the IAU that it would be a dwarf planet. There are a couple of things that it was problematic for him about this. There are several dwarf planets: Ceres, Eris, Haumea, Sedna, Koior, and a whole bunch more. And if we kept Pluto a planet, we had to call all them planet. It doesn't clear its orbit. What that means is if it's going around in its orbital path around the Sun, there can't be other stuff floating around in there that hasn't become dominant to that particular planet, like the moons. That's a problem. Earth doesn't clear its orbit. So if you're going to kick Pluto out, you got to kick Earth out. Neptune doesn't clear its orbit. So do you kick Neptune out too because Pluto shares an orbital path? He created more problems than he fixed by kicking Pluto. So, if you demote Pluto, remember there's an asteroid 2010 HO3 that orbits around the Earth but is not a moon. Therefore, Earth doesn't clear its orbit, and therefore Earth is not a planet. Neptune doesn't clear its orbit. It shares its path with Pluto. And Jupiter has more in common with the Sun, a star, than the other planets. Jupiter and the Sun are both made up mostly of hydrogen and helium, but Jupiter isn't big enough to create fusion at its core. So Jupiter is really a star that isn't on fire. Thanks, Mike Brown. But don't forget, technically, there are 8 planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune.